this is my 6th time speaking at LeWeb, and so for the first time I asked Loic for a favor when I saw the draft of the program a long time ago, is to be able to interview the CEO of Thomson Reuters, H.Glocer, who I've known for over 15 years now because my company was acquired by Reuters almost at the same time he joined. And so Loic very kindly said, yes. So thank you for that.
And I'm amazed Tom is here, right?
Absolutely. And I can tell you that it was hard because yesterday we were just emailing almost in real time because he was supposed to fly, and when the airport shut down, he ran back to the train station so that he could actually make it to Paris. And so it's my pleasure to call on stage H.Glocer, the CEO of Thomson Reuters.
Welcome, Tom. Welcome, Tom.
Tu vas bien?
Très bien.
Assieds-toi, je t'en prie. So Tom speaks French completely fluently, but I think we'll do the interview in English, if that's okay with you.
Comme tu veux.
Comme tu veux. How you doing? Recovered from your trip?
I'm just blown away. I can't believe how big this conference has gotten. I've been, meaning to come for many years, and I hear about it all over the world. And, great credit to Loic and Géraldine to pull this off, and record snow. Very cool.
Yeah, the record snow wasn't really at the program, I guess. So, Tom, it's really a personal thrill to have you here. Many people know about Reuters as the news agency, which is a very, very small part of the business. So why don't you give us the 60-second version of what Thomson Reuters is?
Okay, I'll do the 3-second version is signal-to-noise ratio. The slightly broader version is wherever professionals need information and software, as if you could still separate what was one and what was the other, to do their jobs in finance, in media, in law, in healthcare, in science, in tax and accounting, we're there. And we're there with essentially 98% electronic services fed to professionals at their place of work or mobile.
And so you're a $15 billion company?
Soon, 13 billion this year.
So you're working on it.
Exactly.
So the biggest part is financial, right? 7 billion, roughly?
Right.
Which is the part which I used to be part of. Can you give
Jeff
us a
is modest. He programmed and created some of the absolutely most advanced, way ahead of its time, software.
Thank you. That was the Bloomberg killer that never killed Bloomberg. Anyway, so finance, $7 billion. Can you give us a sense for what the sort of the main features of the sort of the real-time world, the data world that you guys are providing, and how sort of the new platforms that you've seen coming over the past few years on web services and big data sort of change your perspective?
I mean, I think an interesting trend that cuts well beyond just financial services is that for a long time, all the money was just in these proprietary professional services, which also looked like horrible old green screens. And if there were any consumer-facing services, they were inferior, right? They were free, and people paid a lot for these things behind walled gardens called professional services. The very cool thing over the last, call it 5 years, is the extent to which the consumer experience has influenced and driven the required quality, responsiveness, comprehensiveness, algorithmically driven professional services. So in the latest editions, and we're in the middle of re-platforming and reissuing essentially all of our products, the emphasis is on the obvious things: mobility, ease of use, search, etc.
So when, just before I left, you had introduced Reuters messaging, which was essentially Reuters secured chat. Is that something that everyone sort of is using right now? Have you seen sort of an evolution in the market of that sort of usage?
Well, it struck me that most of the market was using email, including Bloomberg email, and there's nothing wrong with asynchronous email, but that the pace certainly in trading in financial services was so real-time, and everything else we did real-time. why limit yourself only to email? And I also didn't want to do another proprietary email standard when the whole world was going open. So at the time, we teamed up with Microsoft in an early version of Microsoft Messenger and built the infrastructure to do secure instant messaging through bank firewalls and all the stuff that people care about to let you into their lands.
Yeah, knowing that we have, Reuters has very specific sort of requirements in terms of ability to audit and so on and so forth. The interesting sort of anecdote is that way back when, in 94, 95, when the internet started to develop, there was a choice to be made whether we would have our private address space or just use the internet. And so you remember that great Reuters search and server where we actually replicated our own address space that was a duplicate of the open internet. That sort of was a bit of a mistake, I guess. At that time. That was a bit of a mistake because we had to sort of remove that search and server after a few years. So out of the world of legal, we were talking yesterday about what you guys have been doing around the ability to track every single search that lawyers have been doing so that you can actually build algorithms to understand better how data should be structured and organized. Can you talk a bit about that? It's a $4 billion sort of market for you.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it's the type of thing like people say, oh, wow, with all these interesting consumer apps, how interesting could it possibly be running research system and communication systems and taxonomies for lawyers and law firms? But it's actually a huge business. We employ over 1,000 lawyers still doing essentially value-added human editing. But I think there are a lot of very cool trends that you can see at work. So the thing we were talking about last night, which is an idea I find captivating, is we have a huge proprietary advantage, which comes from well over 100 years in the US of classifying and databasing every legal document, court opinions, law review journals, statutes, and the like. And we have a human-built classification system, a taxonomy built by hand of over 100,000 separate items, buckets, categories that legal documents fit in. And that's a huge advantage, although the way we think about and try and not get tsunamied is, as much of an advantage as it's been for 100 years, how do we tiptoe, how do we translate, how do we curve jump to the next advantage? And it often means giving up what you have today. And so you can algorithmically, obviously, and PageRank algorithms are one of the ways, you can create on-the-fly electronic taxonomies. The key there, of course, is having enough of the searches coming through so you can capture the data so that you can then train your algorithms to create really good taxonomies. I think the slow, dumb old company sits on its proprietary advantage forever, denies the algorithmic future. No one could ever be as good as my 1,000 lawyers categorizing the stuff. And then in the end, somebody comes out of left field and does it. And what we try and do across all our businesses, and it's one reason why, I guess personally, I come to events like this, we love investing with you, is we have to constantly challenge ourselves. Are the things that got us here going to get us to the next stage? And in the example in law, the great example, and it has nothing to do with me, it's all the smart people who are at Thomson Reuters, is they've thought ahead about this, and they've made that transition. And before we lose the 1 million legal searches a day that come through our systems, we've built the algorithmic taxonomy to supplement the brute force human one.
That's a great segue to one of the topics I wanted to address, which is one of the recent trend we've seen is crowdsourcing. So the ability to use massive amount of sometimes very small tasks to build, to cleanse some data sets, sometimes at massive scale. Have you guys sort of leveraged that? Because I remember way back when we used to have thousands and thousands of data analysts who were cleansing data for us. Anything sort of moving forward to today? Anything you guys have done to leverage that?
I mean, in some ways, and we were kidding about this as well, I made the somewhat pretentious claim that Reuters invented UGC, user-contributed generated content, 40 years ago, because one of the fundamental parts of the financial business used to be banks would contribute, would send us their rates, the rates at which they were prepared to deal in foreign currencies or in bonds or whatever it was. We would aggregate it, clean it, run some tests on it, normalize it, create metadata already then around it, although we didn't call it that, and sell it back to the same banks. And it was the most amazing model in the world, because banks would actually pay us to give us the content, because it was advertising for them, and then turn around and pay us again to take back the aggregated feed. Those days we'll never see again, maybe, at least not in our business. We used to call it stuffing dollar bills into both ends of a tube, negative working capital, all these wonderful things. It happens still to be a good business to the tune of about $7 billion a year in our markets division. But that got us, I guess, from the very beginning, thinking creatively about, does all the content have to come from us? No, absolutely not. We have to do more than just a simple aggregation of stuff that's available publicly. So we think about, I guess, the second derivative. What can we do to aggregate intelligently? What's our data model? What's the symbology set? What are the APIs we publish? How do people have access? How do we fit the workflow of what they do every day in their jobs?
And so social media is the other sort of important component that we've seen developing over the past few years. Clearly, that has had an impact in the way the news business has been developing. How do you guys sort of leverage blogs, Twitter, and so on and so forth, those kinds of tools to push your content through, and how do you think, as one of the most important sort of news agencies in the world, to sort of leverage that and get closer to your users or your readers?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly don't have the answer and wouldn't pretend that we do. Reuters has into the several 100,000 followers on Twitter, and we play with a lot of things. So we got a lot of notoriety a few years ago because we introduced a real live journalist into Second Life, because it seemed like an interesting, I've always been interested in immersive environments, in particular whether one day we could represent graphically trading flows in an immersive 3D environment rather than just a flat, typical charting environment. So we've been playful with our content. To some extent, we've always had exposure to a citizen journalist complement to what are on-staff journalists. We have about 3,000 journalists out of 55,000 people around the world. But we also have stringers, and stringers, which is not a new concept for journalists. Stringers are people who aren't on your payroll per se, but who work via contract for you. And they range from people who are almost exclusively working for you, say for 20 years, and you know everything about them, and they might as well be on staff, to people who are in a distant location and maybe one story a year they cover for you. So, when I think of things like blogosphere, citizen journalism, et cetera, there's not this huge dichotomy between the high priesthood, who are trained professional journalists, and then the great unwashed. They're a series of gray colors, and what's important isn't the label you put on the person. What's important is thinking through, what's the quality of the content, its accuracy, its timeliness, what is your brand saying about what you've done with respect to the content? If all you're doing is aggregating it, I don't know exactly what your brand is saying other than we run a spider or something. But if you actually have standards, training, if there are things that you hold yourself out to do when you publish under the Reuters name, then you begin to add something to what you're collecting, whether you create it yourself or whether you participate in a more open editing construct.
So we've seen the explosion of video really take hold over the past 3-5 years. I remember RFTV that we launched back in 95 or 96, and you guys just launched another video product. Just yesterday I got the announcement in my inbox, Reuters Insider. Can you give us a sense for the sort of the difference? You had sort of this hilarious explanation to me as to what it meant 15 years ago to have that network.
Yeah, what we thought was the world did not need another linear broadcast, business-oriented television service. You know, there's some good ones out there. Some of them make money. Most of them actually don't in many locations. But what we thought that professionals need is video is just one of the ways in which you tell a story. Some things are easier to digest in a headline. Some things like editorial comment is sometimes better in a column, but other things are really suitable to video. Obviously scenes of protests, things like that, but also, you know, sometimes I like to see Trichet's face when he talks about quantitative easing. You know, does he raise an eyebrow or not? And so Reuters Insider is an open multimedia platform. We program to it in clip-oriented segments, but it's also an open platform, an ecosystem. So there's a Goldman Sachs channel, there's a BNP Paribas channel there. We're aggregating a lot of other video information, and it turns out that, for instance, banks create a huge amount of video content which they're not particularly adept at distributing. It's things like sell-side analysts' reports on companies, or the morning call of, you know, what they're pushing to the sales force that morning. And because we allow them to permission, so you get it, but I don't, and because we go to, you know, over 400,000 desktops around the world, it's essentially a closed circuit but open technology, open platform way to deliver video content. And what we do at the same time is we create an on-the-fly machine transcript. For some of the video, for some of those transcripts, we then have it human verified to improve the accuracy. We then run the text through a system called Open Calais, which I know you know, tag it and extract the metadata, and then pull in other content that we have in our system. So if, I don't know, Trichet's talking about euro volatility over the last 30 days, it gets tagged for euro. It'll pull in, assuming your permission to receive the data, real-time euro quotes, euro 30-day graph, things like that. And, you know, we would have needed 10,000 programmers to do that ourselves. What we've been able to do is leverage the open standards.
Was Open Calais an acquisition of yours, or was that something that you are just sort of leveraging?
Which one?
Was Open Calais an acquisition?
Yeah. No, it was a, I think it's a company that Yossi might have turned me on to first in Israel. It's called Clear Forest, you know, and coming out of the, you know, the sort of intelligence community, there was Religence and Clear Forest were the two companies that essentially took unstructured data and did on-the-fly extraction of signals and on-the-fly taxonomies. I think AOL bought Religence and then sold it on. I'm not sure whatever happened to that group, but we've kept the Clear Forest folks very much at the heart of the group.
So Reuters is very much, I mean, Thomson Reuters, I need to get used to it, is very much a professional brand, but there is a real sort of consumer internet recognition. Have you had any sort of real ambition to build a direct consumer brand that could benefit the rest of the organization?
Yeah, I mean, we sort of have a consumer following almost less by intention and more just because people find and, thank God, trust us. In particular in crisis, and particularly with respect to international serious news and economics, they turn to Reuters.com or some of the apps we have out. We have a wonderful iPad app out called News Pro, which is free. We are thinking about whether we couldn't, the time isn't right, to aggregate a serious international audience. We're a fairly serious company. We're unlikely to put the pretty blonde on the couch to read news to you or to have banter back and forth about, hey, how was the game last night? And the challenge in traditional broadcast has been to reach a large enough audience to monetize via advertising or to pay back the cost of cable carriage, or even in the old days in newspapers, to pay back distribution in the printing plant. You had to go quite broad. And to go broad, at least in big countries like the US, tends to mean you got to get a bit closer to some of the people who Yossi was showing in his amusing videos. And that's just not stuff we do well. But the neat thing about what the internet has done for us all is it is now possible to aggregate the smaller proportion, let's say, of Americans who listen to NPR, might watch the BBC, read The Economist, etc., and the equal or larger number of Germans and French who do, into an international audience. You still have the language issue, but this conference is in English. So we're looking at whether there actually might now be a time to do more of it.
Cool. I'd like to spend the last couple of minutes talking about WikiLeaks. So clearly, you guys have been subject to accessing over the years that sort of information. And as a news organization, you had to make the determination as to what to do about this. So in this context, how do you look at Julian Assange, and what would be sort of your Reuters sort of look at that situation? What should he have done? What should he not have done?
I mean, again, because we have largely a professional audience, who, by the way, care about this issue as well, we're not faced like a newspaper going to press at 11 o'clock at night, will I run it, will I not run it? Our bias is always toward publishing, toward transparency. There have been occasions over the 160-year history at Reuters where we've been in possession of, and not me, by the way, the editors, and the editor-in-chief has made a call that certain information that he has, let's say about troop movements or about the identity of human beings in dangerous locations, is newsworthy, but so puts in danger human lives that we will self-censor. But what we would never agree to is a government telling us, you can run this and you can't run that. The challenge, of course, and it's easy for me to sit here and say that, the challenge is, of course, when you get to the volume of raw data involved in the WikiLeaks cases, the question becomes, do the folks at WikiLeaks have the context so they can make those calls? We're typically in possession of very specific information about one thing, not we got to comb through 100,000 State Department cables and there might be 3 of them with damaging information. And the trouble is, from the outside, you don't really know what's damaging or not. So I think it's a really difficult issue. The one point that I don't see enough people focusing on is, what was the negligence on the part of the government in having such broad access in the first place to this? It's easy to divert attention and point the finger at WikiLeaks, but I always think, look to yourself first. Have we done, if it's such sensitive material, have we done everything possible to restrict it to a need-to-know basis? And I just don't, from the facts I know, and I probably don't know everything, it doesn't look that way from the outside.
I'm pretty sure they're going to change that. So, you've been blogging for 3-4 years. You have a Twitter account, H.Glocer. You don't Twitter much, or don't tweet much. Is there any reason why you sort of don't use that account more, or time?
I think it's more, my life is more async than sync. So, when you run a big company with a lot of people, most of my time's in the face-to-face world, as much externally as possible, but also seeing our own people. Like today, I'm going to go visit your former colleagues and thank them for doing just a totally awesome job building Thomson Reuters Icon, our latest financial services platform. So blogging, and by the way, I do that wrong too. So some very well-intentioned, smart person who totally got what blogging was supposed to be came to see me soon after I started writing and said, Tom, you don't understand what to do. You're supposed to, blog at least 4 or 5 times a day. You got to have fresh material. People aren't going to come to your site. Your traffic's going to be low. I said, look, I'm not trying to sell advertising or something. I'm doing it for a whole range of special purposes that are important to me. So the Twitter thing is I'm more of a voyeur on Twitter. Every now and then I'll tweet something if it's amusing, but it's just doesn't fit as well as the async does, because I do that mostly up in the air on airplanes.
Okay. Well, we just hope to hear more of you because it's been really interesting. Join me in thanking Tom for being on stage, and thanks for coming to Paris.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for coming, just for us.